On New Year's Day, 1953, the world woke up to devastating news. Hank Williams, the 29-year-old king of country music, had been found dead in the back seat of his Cadillac. The official story was that he died of heart failure, but what most people don't know is that in his final days, Williams was under the care of a man who called himself Dr. Toby Marshall. The truth? Marshall wasn't a doctor at all. He was a fraud with a criminal record who administered dangerous drug cocktails to Williams right before his death. This is the dark, twisted story of how a fake doctor contributed to the death of country music's greatest legend. Before diving into the dark circumstances of his death, let's understand who Hank Williams was. Born Hiram King Williams in 1923 in Alabama, Hank grew up in poverty during the Great Depression. He learned guitar from a black street performer named Rufus T. Tot Payne, who taught him the blues techniques that became fundamental to his sound. By age 14, Williams was already performing, and by his early 20s, he had caught the attention of music executives. In 1947, he signed with MGM Records and released his first major hit, Move It On Over. Soon after, he was invited to perform at the Grand Ole Opry, country music's most prestigious stage. Between 1947 and 1953, Williams released 35 singles, with 11 reaching #1 on the country charts. Songs like Lovesick Blues, Cold, Cold Heart, and Jambalaya became instant classics, transcending the country genre and influencing music for generations. But as his star rose, Williams' personal demons grew stronger. The back pain from his spina bifida occulta became increasingly unbearable. He turned to alcohol to numb the pain, developing a severe drinking problem that frequently interfered with his performances. By 1952, Williams' life was spiraling. His marriage had ended, his drinking worsened, and the Grand Ole Opry had fired him due to unreliability. Despite these setbacks, he continued creating incredible music, channeling his pain into art. It was during this vulnerable period that a man calling himself Dr. Toby Marshall entered Williams' life, a decision that would have fatal consequences for the country music legend. In late 1952, Hank Williams was desperate. His back pain had become excruciating, his alcoholism was out of control, and his career was hanging by a thread. It was at this critical moment that Williams was introduced to a man who called himself Dr. Toby Marshall, though as we'll soon discover, he was neither a Toby nor a doctor. The introduction came through Horace Hoss Marshall, who worked at the radio station where Williams performed. Hoss claimed his cousin was a physician who specialized in treating alcoholism and could help Williams get back on track. Marshall presented himself as a confident medical professional with innovative treatments for addiction and chronic pain. Unlike other doctors who advised Williams to stop performing and enter long-term treatment, Marshall promised a quick fix that would allow him to continue touring, exactly what Williams wanted to hear. Marshall began prescribing Williams a dangerous cocktail of medications, including chloral hydrate, a powerful sedative, and B12 injections laced with amphetamines. This combination of uppers and downers temporarily masked Williams' symptoms, but made his underlying conditions worse. Williams trusted Marshall immediately and followed his prescribed regimen faithfully. What he couldn't have known was that the man he was entrusting with his health was a complete fraud with no medical license, training, or legitimate knowledge. As 1952 drew to a close, Williams' health continued to deteriorate under Marshall's care. Yet somehow the country star remained convinced that Marshall was helping him, a misplaced trust that would prove fatal as Williams prepared for New Year's performances he would never live to complete. The man treating Hank Williams wasn't Dr. Toby Marshall at all. His real name was Toby Marshall Carr, and he was no physician. In fact, he had absolutely no medical training whatsoever. Carr was a con artist who had spent years pretending to be a doctor, preying on vulnerable patients who were desperate for help. Born in Oklahoma, Carr had a history of trouble with the law long before he met Williams. He had been arrested multiple times for various offenses, including forgery and fraud. In one particularly telling incident, he had been caught impersonating a doctor in Oklahoma City, where he had treated several patients before being exposed. Despite having no medical degree or license, Carr had become skilled at mimicking the language and mannerisms of physicians. He had worked briefly as an orderly in a hospital, where he had picked up enough medical terminology to sound convincing to non-medical professionals. He carried a medical bag, wore a white coat when appropriate, and had even obtained prescription pads through illegal means. What made Carr's deception particularly effective was his charisma. Those who met him described him as charming and confident. He looked people in the eye when speaking to them, never hesitated when asked medical questions, and projected an air of authority that few questioned. In an era before instant background checks and online verification, it was relatively easy for someone like Carr to maintain such a deception. Carr specifically targeted entertainers and musicians, recognizing that they often had unique medical needs and demanding schedules that made traditional medical care challenging. He understood that performers like Williams needed to stay on the road and couldn't afford lengthy hospital stays or rehabilitation programs. By promising quick fixes that would allow them to continue performing, he found a niche that made his services particularly appealing. Before meeting Williams, Carr had treated several other musicians in the country music scene, building a reputation through word of mouth. None of these performers or their managers ever thought to verify his credentials. After all, he had been recommended by trusted friends or colleagues, and he seemed to know what he was talking about. What's particularly disturbing is that some people in Williams' circle had heard rumors about Carr's legitimacy but dismissed them. In the hard-drinking, fast-living world of country music in the early 1950s, unconventional medical treatments weren't uncommon, and the line between legitimate and questionable care was often blurry. By the time Carr began treating Williams, he had refined his act to perfection. He knew exactly what to say to gain the trust of a man in pain, and he understood precisely how to exploit Williams's desperation. The stage was set for a tragedy that would cut short the life of one of music's greatest talents. The treatments Marshall prescribed to Hank Williams weren't just ineffective, they were potentially lethal. Without any medical training, Marshall was essentially experimenting on Williams, combining powerful drugs with no understanding of their interactions or proper dosages. At the center of Marshall's treatment plan was chloral hydrate, a powerful sedative that was dangerous when combined with alcohol, a fact any legitimate doctor would have known. For Williams, an alcoholic, this prescription was particularly hazardous. Marshall also administered injections he claimed contained vitamin B12 for energy. In reality, these shots were laced with amphetamines, creating a dangerous cycle where Williams would be artificially stimulated, then sedated with chloral hydrate. This roller coaster of uppers and downers put tremendous strain on Williams's already compromised heart. According to witnesses, Marshall's injection technique was crude and non-sterile. He often used the same needle multiple times without proper sterilization, leaving Williams's arms bruised and swollen from improper needle use. Perhaps most disturbing was Marshall's special formula, a mysterious concoction that he mixed himself and refused to disclose its ingredients, claiming it was proprietary. Those who saw this mixture described it as a cloudy liquid that Marshall would inject directly into Williams' arm. The effects were immediately visible. After receiving Marshall's injections, Williams would often appear disoriented and slur his words. His performances became increasingly erratic, sometimes forgetting lyrics to songs he had performed hundreds of times. By December 1952, Williams had become completely dependent on Marshall's treatments. He could barely function without them, yet they were steadily destroying what remained of his health, setting the stage for the tragic final days that would end with Williams's premature death. The last week of Hank Williams' life reads like a tragic countdown under Marshall's dangerous influence. On December 26, 1952, Williams arrived in Knoxville, Tennessee, visibly ill and struggling to stand without assistance. He was scheduled to perform several shows leading up to New Year's Day. Recognizing Williams' deteriorating condition, Marshall increased the frequency and dosage of his treatments. On December 28th, witnesses reported seeing Marshall administer multiple injections, after which Williams became so disoriented he could barely communicate. On December 29th, Williams attempted to perform in Charleston, West Virginia, but was unable to complete his set. Audience members described him as looking like a ghost. After stumbling through just 3 songs, Williams had to be helped off stage. Rather than seeking emergency medical care, Marshall administered more treatments backstage. On December 30th, bad weather canceled Williams' flight. His driver, Charles Carr, no relation to Toby Marshall Carr, was tasked with driving him to his next destination. Before departing, Marshall gave Williams what would be his final treatments, injections that left the singer barely conscious. According to Carr's testimony, Williams was in such poor condition that he had to be carried to the car. Marshall assured Carr that Williams just needed to sleep off the medication. During the journey, Carr made several attempts to rouse Williams, becoming increasingly concerned by the lack of response. During a stop in Oak Hill, West Virginia, in the early hours of January 1, 1953, Carr touched Williams' body and found it cold and rigid. He immediately drove to a nearby hospital, but it was too late. Hank Williams was pronounced dead on arrival at 7:00 a.m. on New Year's Day, 1953. The circumstances surrounding Hank Williams' death in the back seat of his Cadillac raised immediate questions. How could a 29-year-old man, despite his health problems, simply die in his sleep? And what role did the mysterious Dr. Marshall play in this tragedy? When Williams' body arrived at the hospital in Oak Hill, West Virginia, the attending physician noted several disturbing details. Williams' body showed signs of rigor mortis, indicating he had been dead for several hours. There were multiple injection marks on his arms, some fresh and others infected. Most tellingly, there were traces of unidentified substances in his system. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, a vague determination that revealed little about what actually happened. In 1953, forensic science was still developing, and toxicology tests were limited in scope. Many substances, particularly unusual drug combinations, couldn't be detected with the technology available. Adding to the mystery was Marshall's immediate disappearance after learning of Williams' death. He didn't come forward to provide medical records or information about the treatments he had administered. Instead, he vanished, avoiding any questioning by authorities or Williams' family. The car itself contained additional clues. Empty pill bottles were found in Williams' luggage, some prescribed by legitimate doctors and others with labels that couldn't be traced to any pharmacy. A notebook with handwritten instructions, presumably from Marshall, detailed a complex schedule of medications that no legitimate doctor would have prescribed together. Williams' body was quickly transported back to Montgomery, Alabama for burial, with no comprehensive autopsy performed. This rapid movement, combined with the limited investigation, meant that crucial evidence was lost forever, leaving us with questions that may never be fully answered. After Williams' death, the man who called himself Dr. Toby Marshall disappeared. For several weeks, no one could locate him, and many began to question who this mysterious doctor really was. It wasn't until authorities started investigating that the truth emerged. Investigators discovered that Dr. Toby Marshall was actually Toby Marshall Carr, a known con artist with no medical training whatsoever. His medical license was completely fabricated, and he had a criminal record in multiple states for fraud, forgery, and impersonating a medical professional. When authorities finally tracked down Carr in February 1953, he was already working under a new identity in a different state. When confronted about Williams' death, Carr denied any wrongdoing, claiming that Williams was already in poor health and that his treatments were standard for the time. Despite the obvious fraud and suspicious circumstances, Carr faced surprisingly few consequences. He was charged with practicing medicine without a license, a relatively minor offense at the time, but was never directly charged in connection with Williams' death. After paying a small fine and serving a brief jail sentence, he was released. Williams' family, particularly his mother Lillian, was outraged by the lenient treatment of Carr. She publicly accused him of killing her son and demanded justice. However, her pleas fell on deaf ears as the case was considered closed by authorities. Perhaps most disturbing was how quickly Carr returned to his old ways. Within a year of Williams' death, he was operating under yet another false identity, targeting entertainers and musicians with promises of miracle cures. It would take several more years and additional victims before he was finally imprisoned for a significant period on multiple fraud charges. While the official cause of Hank Williams' death was listed simply as heart failure, the full medical examiner's report contained disturbing details that were kept from the public for decades. The initial examination revealed numerous injection sites, many showing signs of infection and improper technique. The medical examiner noted that these injections appear to have been administered by someone with little or no medical training, consistent with Marshall's lack of credentials. More alarming were the substances found in Williams' system. The examiner detected dangerous levels of chloral hydrate, the sedative Marshall had been administering. The concentration was high enough that it alone could have caused respiratory depression and death, especially in combination with alcohol. There were also traces of morphine and other unidentified substances that couldn't be precisely identified with the tools available in 1953. Modern forensic experts who have reviewed the findings believe these were likely amphetamines and other stimulants, consistent with the upper and downer cocktail Marshall was known to administer. Perhaps most damning was the examiner's conclusion that Williams had been dead for 6 to 8 hours before arriving at the hospital. In his private notes, he wrote that the death appeared to be the result of acute drug toxicity complicated by alcohol, far more specific than the vague heart failure listed on the death certificate. These findings were suppressed to protect Williams' legacy, avoid legal complications, and shield his family from the stigma of addiction in the 1950s. It would take nearly 30 years before journalists and historians began to uncover these hidden aspects of the medical report. Hank Williams' death at age 29 cut short one of the most promising careers in music history. In just 6 short years as a recording artist, he had revolutionized country music, bringing raw emotion and authentic storytelling to the genre in a way that had never been done before. The circumstances of his death at the hands of a fraudulent doctor add a layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking story. Williams wasn't just a victim of his own demons. He was a victim of medical fraud and exploitation. Had he received proper medical care instead of Marshall's dangerous treatments, he might have continued creating music for decades. Williams' death sparked important conversations about medical oversight. In the years following the revelation of Marshall's fraud, medical boards implemented stricter protocols for verifying physician credentials. The music industry also began taking a more active role in ensuring the well-being of their artists. For fans, Williams' death transformed him from star to legend. His music took on new meaning as listeners recognized the authentic pain behind lyrics like, "I'm so lonesome I could cry, and you're cheating hard." The knowledge that he died so young adds poignancy to every note he recorded. Williams' son, Hank Williams Jr., and later his grandson, Hank Williams III, carried on his musical legacy, each adding their own chapter while acknowledging the towering influence of their patriarch. Perhaps the most important legacy of Williams' tragic end is as a cautionary tale about trust and vulnerability. In an era when the opioid crisis has claimed countless lives, Williams' story feels eerily relevant, a historical echo of challenges we still face today. As we look back on the tragic circumstances surrounding Hank Williams' death, it's impossible not to wonder what might have been. Had he lived, Williams would have witnessed the birth of rock and roll, the folk revival, and countless other musical movements his work helped inspire. The story of Toby Marshall Carr, the fraudulent doctor who contributed to Williams' death, serves as a dark reminder of how vulnerable people can be when they're desperate for help. Williams was a man in pain, searching for relief and willing to trust anyone who promised it. What makes this story particularly tragic is how preventable it all was. A simple credential check would have exposed Marshall as a fraud. A legitimate doctor might have recognized Williams' complex health issues and provided appropriate care. Instead, a talented artist was essentially poisoned by a charlatan who disappeared after his patient died. The secrecy surrounding the true circumstances of Williams' death also robbed his family and fans of closure for decades. While the official story of heart failure wasn't technically false, it obscured the more complex and troubling reality. Today, Williams' legacy transcends the circumstances of his death. His music continues to resonate with new generations of listeners who connect with the raw emotion in songs like "Cold, Cold Heart" and "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry." His influence can be heard in countless artists across multiple genres. Hank Williams may have died at 29, but his music achieved the immortality he never could. And while the dark truth about his doctor adds a troubling chapter to his story, it doesn't diminish the power of his artistic legacy. A legacy that continues to move and inspire listeners more than 7 decades after his untimely death.